Hello and welcome to the Untitled Integrated Management Case Study video series for the August 2016 preseen on Sparkspace. So before we begin, I'm just going to start by telling you a little bit about myself and a bit about how we are going to approach the preseen and the things we're going to be looking for. So my name is Peter Steffer. I am the Director of SEMA here at Untitled. I've been with the company since 2013, and during that time I've written and marked many of the mock exams that we provide, and I've also written mocks for other tuition providers. I've also written many of the study texts that you may have used. And if you see in the bottom left hand corner there, my Facebook page, on the run up to the exam I'll be posting all kinds of hints and tips. So now let's take a look at the video series themselves. So for starters, I'm going to go through the preseen section by section, picking up on all the key points, the things that you should be looking for, the things you should be pulling out of the text and analysing. I'll then be applying them to the case itself, what they mean for the company and what it means for the industry that it operates in. Applying certain business models to it, ones that you may have learnt in your objective test studies, and the likely exam issues. So looking at it and thinking, based on this information, a likely question is X. And also other just hints and tips, general things that will help you gain extra marks in the exam. I'll then go on to my strategic analysis video, which will be taking the preseen as a whole and summarizing it and applying it into lots of different key business models and key business theories before rounding up with my top 10 issues. So these are the most likely things I think are going to come up in the actual exam. So how's it going to work? As I said, I'm going to go through it section by section. I'm going to assume that you haven't read the preseen. I'm going to assume that this is all new to you and we are going through it together for the first time. And what I'm going to do is I'm going to ask you to make notes yourself. So I'll stop the videos at the start of each one and ask you to make notes on a certain number of pages, and then we'll go back and review it together. And as I've said, at the end we'll go through a full strategic analysis and top 10 issues. So first of all, some key things that you should be aware of. Now the preseen is the context of the exam. It's the context of the company that is being examined. The background information, as it were. So once you've read the preseen, this should all be forming a foundation in your mind, and when you go into the actual exam, all the unseen questions that come up in the actual exam, you should be answering them based on this base context from the preseen. But it's worth noting that you shouldn't write anything based on the preseen. That's because you're not necessarily going to be tested on something that's in the preseen. You'll be tested on the unseen material that you are given in the exam. If that unseen material is nothing to do with the material in the preseen, then you shouldn't be using the preseen material to answer the question. You must always use the unseen material. Having said that, you should always be thinking about the preseen material. Now, you're given this in advance for a reason. You're supposed to learn it and you're supposed to gain as much understanding as you can about the company so that you can use this information in the actual exam. So let's take a look at the preseen itself. Now, the first thing I'm going to ask you to do is to read the first 3 pages of the preseen. So down to here, make some notes and then join me back at the top and we'll go through it together. Now, a lot of the time people will skip the introduction to the preseen. They'll skip ahead to the more tangible things such as the financial statement, the SWOT analysis, and other things like that that they can apply their tangible knowledge to. But actually there's a lot of information within the first 3 pages that will give us a setup, give us some context, as it were, for the rest of the preseen. In the introductory section I mentioned about how the preseen is the context for the unseen, and the introduction to the preseen is in turn the context to the preseen. It starts off by saying that we are a finance manager reporting to the senior financial manager and ultimately the finance director. Now that will give us some indication of the kinds of things that we will be reporting on. We know that we are a financial manager reporting to the senior financial manager, so there's a chance that most of what we will be doing will be of a tactical level. In a sense, taking the strategies of the organization and applying them to the organization. But as ultimately we are going to be reporting to the financial director, we also have to think about what the financial director will be using our reports for. They will be using their reports to talk to the rest of the board to come up with decisions that affect the way the business works. And therefore you have to consider that when you are writing your reports. And therefore you should be sure to add your own analysis, your own recommendations. Don't just write a report that contains the relevant analysis, come to an appropriate conclusion and make a recommendation, because that will be really helpful for the manager, for the senior manager and the financial director. And we know that we are responsible for overseeing the management accounting function for Sparkspace, including the preparation of the budget. So what kinds of things will we have to talk about when referring to budgets? Well, of course, there's the obvious, there's the variance analysis, there's the setting of the budget, also the type of budget being used. As we know, there are three main types of budgets. You have incremental budgeting, which is the easiest to do based on historical information, but is it appropriate for a fast-moving culture? There's activity-based budgeting, which is based on cost drivers, the things that actually incur costs, a bit like activity-based costing. And finally, zero-based budgeting, which is all about justifying the cost before it can go into the budget, which is useful for companies with a large amount of discretionary spending. You will also be assisting the finance director. So again, this idea of using the information to make the strategic decisions comes to the fore again. In drawing up costs and advising on pricing for specific projects. So we know that a large amount of the management level SEMA syllabus, particularly for E2, is based around project management. So given the importance of project management and the fact that we've already been told at this early stage that part of our job is to advise on projects, we can be sure that an issue, a potential issue relating to projects, relating to project management, project setting could come up in the unseen exam. So you'll need to remember the kinds of things that go into a project. First of all, we have the initiation stage, deciding on the customer's needs. Is it feasible for them? Will it meet their requirements? Then there's the planning stage, drawing up plans and effectively implementing. Then the execution stage, actually going ahead with the project, putting everything in its place. Monitoring the project, has it been successful, what needs to be done to continue making it successful, or if it's not been successful, what needs to be done to mitigate the impact or to overturn the impact of this failing project. And finally, the completion stage, the handover. Once we've dealt with the customer, once we've fulfilled their needs, we then need to effectively hand over control of the project to them so that they can be allowed to continue using and making effective use of the project that we have done for them. So as you can see, we already have a lot of things to work with going forward throughout the rest of our analysis of the preseen. Now the second page brings us on to the company itself, the background of the organization. Now Sparkspace supplies and supports IT infrastructure, primarily in the form of service. So now we have an industry, which of course opens us up to industry analysis. So what is the IT infrastructure industry like? Is it competitive? Where do we get our supplies from? Who do we sell to? How easy is it for other competitors to enter the market? And are there any substitutes to it? As you can guess, I'm talking about Porter's 5 forces here. So we need to find out how large our customers are and also how large our suppliers are. Obviously, if our suppliers are small in number and they're very powerful, then they will be able to dictate the prices to us. If we have a lot of suppliers and we can pick and choose, then of course we will have high buyer power to them and they will have low supplier power to us. Likewise, when it comes to our customers, do we only have a few major customers and therefore we rely on them and therefore they have high buyer power? Or do we have many different small customers that we can sell to, in which case we have low buyer power? And the company specializes in servers. So as we can see here, a server is a service for another device called clients. So a corporate database, a corporation would be a customer. In this instance, a corporation would employ Sparkspace to set up a server system for it, which will have access to services such as email, websites, print facilities, all the things that go into the running of an organization. They could also be used to provide specialist data processing, particularly when a lot of data processing is required. Now, when you see this, you should instantly be thinking about big data. The reason why big data is particularly important is because it's one of SEMA's big new topics. It's something that they have spoken a lot about since the release of the new syllabus, and they talk about how important it is. Now, big data is essentially where you have a huge myriad of information, lots of different information, lots of different types of information, and to the human eye or to standard data processing tools, it's complete nonsense. It's like looking for a needle in a haystack. But a big data system allows you to actively and effectively mine this data and make logical conclusions from it. And it works as a strategic resource as well, because it allows you to plan for the future using information that you never thought possible. And big data is often used in the retail industry to find links between purchases. And a classic example of this is when American retailer Walmart found out that there was a direct correlation between the purchase of nappies or diapers and beer. Now, this may sound like a really stupid thing. Now, why on earth would there be a correlation between nappies and beer? Well, actually there is a link, and that link is the fact that a lot of customers of nappies were men coming home from work, buying the nappies on the way home. And now you can set the scene for the possible story here. So their wife phones them up during the day and says, "Can you get more nappies on the way home?" So they go to the shop, they go to Walmart on the way home, and then they think, oh, they've got to go home to a crying baby. Perhaps they've had a stressful day at work, so they think, while I'm here, I'll get some beer as well. Now, it sounds quite logical when you say that, and to be fair, it is. But we only know that now because we know that there is a direct correlation between that. You wouldn't have initially just thought that. And in fact, Walmart conducted research using a big data system and found this out. And to the naked eye, to the human eye, to a standard data processing system, they never would have uncovered this. It was just because of using a big data system that they found that at particular times of day, the sales of nappies and sales of beer went up. And they went up in correlation. And so what did they do about this? They then readjusted their lines, readjusted their aisles so that nappies and beer would be near each other. And so now the sales of nappies and beer together have gone up even further since. So this is a classic example of where big data can help make decisions for companies in the future. And so we can guess that a lot of customers of Sparkspace may be hoping for a similar thing, and that's why they want a lot of these state-of-the-art servers to process vast amounts of data. Now, Sparkspace itself acts as a value-added reseller. So what this means is that they will get the servers from large hardware suppliers, as you can see here, major hardware vendors, and then they will add value to the customer, perhaps by configuring the software that is then processed by the hardware, by the servers, so that it creates a user-friendly system that allows our corporate customers to process all the information stored on the servers. So when you see value added, you should be thinking about value analysis, you should be thinking about value chains. So how do we add value in our business, in Sparkspace? Do we start off by having quality inputs, by only buying from the best major hardware vendors, not buying cheap servers? Do we then add value during our operations by effective planning, by effective consultation services? And of course you can imagine that things like after-sales service will be very important, because if we set up a server system for a customer, then we leave, and a month later they have problems with the server. They may have spent hundreds of thousands on this server system, and therefore they will want to be able to contact Sparkspace, to have Sparkspace send out an engineer, send out someone who can fix the system. So there are a lot of ways in which Sparkspace can add value here. Another point I want to bring up is the fact that they are major hardware vendors. So do they have high supplier power? If there are only a few major hardware vendors, then what if one of them decides they don't want to sell through Sparkspace anymore? As you can see, we are an intermediary, and therefore we rely on suppliers, the major hardware vendors, and the end users. What if the major hardware vendors decided that they would start selling directly to the end user? What could that mean for our business? If they already make the product, couldn't they just invest in producing a consultancy business unit that in a sense does what Sparkspace does? And so that would be a threat to the organization in the future. And we can see that the hardware vendors generally focus on manufacturing in large quantities in order to obtain economies of scale. So in a sense they can sell at a lower price because they are producing so much. And does that show that the suppliers, the major hardware vendors, are perhaps operating a cost leadership strategy? They're trying to beat each other by being the cheapest on the market. And that in turn is relevant to our supplier power, because of course even if there are only a few major hardware vendors which would suggest an increase in supplier power, if they are all very much the same and they're forced to compete on cost because they're producing the same product, that in turn lowers the supplier power because there's nothing to differentiate them between each other. Now the hardware vendors themselves buy generic electronic components, so that the vendors that create the servers themselves buy in all the various components from specialist manufacturers. So again, we now have a second industry here, the industry that supplies our industry. So we have another set of buyer power, supplier power, etc. Now, the key word here is specialist manufacturers. So if they are specialist, are they one of the only people in the world that does it? If a particular hardware vendor is purchasing processors from a processing company that specializes in producing processors, memory from a memory company that produces specialist memory components and hard disks, etc., will the supplier power be high? And therefore, any costs associated with the hardware vendors having to pay for specialist components from specialist manufacturers will in turn be passed on to us. So you can see how cost and how value is being added further up the manufacturing chain now. And it also highlights potential expansion opportunities. So could Sparkspace, in a sense, integrate backwards by buying a hardware vendor or by starting to produce the hardware themselves, and in turn deal with these specialist manufacturers of processors, memories and hard disks, or then go a step further again and perhaps start making their own processors, their own memory, their own hard disks. Now, of course, they will not have the experience of these specialist manufacturers, but it will allow them to control costs. But there is an allowance for differentiation between particular products, because the speed of the server is determined by the performance needed by the consumer, the customer. And of course, they cost more to make because they are fancier, more high-tech pieces of equipment. So one thing I'm going to bring up here is about ethics. So we know that the speed is determined by the performance needed. So therefore we should be trying to sell a system that is based on the requirements of the customer, not on our own requirements. We're not going to try and sell them the most expensive system possible because we have the best yield on it, we get the most money for it. We need to give them one depending on their required performance. If they do not have huge, vast amounts of data, they just want a simple system that can allow them to process printing and email services, then we need to give them a system that allows them to do that, and not one that is far beyond their needs, because that would be unethical. We would not be acting in the best interests of the customer. It's also worth noting that, like big data, as I mentioned earlier, ethics is one of the key topics for CIMA under the new syllabus, and they will always expect you to take the moral high ground. So if we are proposed a project in the case study and the manager says, oh, these people don't know anything about computers, I think we could tell them that they need the most expensive system possible and get the most money out of them, you should be saying, no, that's unethical. We need to take the moral high ground here. We need to just give them what they need. We should not be a company that tries to exploit people. We should be a company that tries to give them the level of performance that they need for their business. And there's some more information here about distinguishing between the products of our hardware vendors. And as you can see, as it already alluded to earlier, there's very little to distinguish, very little room for differentiation. And so they do compete on price. And again, this ties back to supplier power. This does mean that if we were to pursue our idea of integrating backwards up the chain, then we would perhaps be entering a market where it was very difficult to make a large amount of profit because they're such commodity products. And particularly when you factor in the fact that we would be dealing with competitors who are established in the market, who have experience in the market, it would be very difficult for us to break into that. Now, the hardware vendors rarely make direct sales to end users, so that perhaps reduces the threat of new entrants into the market, reduces the threat for hardware vendors to start selling directly to end users if that is not part of the industry, it's not what the industry standard is. So that perhaps reduces our threat of new entrants in our five forces. And instead they prefer to act through resellers. Resellers like Sparkspace. And again, Sparkspace adds values by design consultancy, installation, maintenance and assembly to their clients. So on the first page I spoke a lot about project management, and this is where that project management comes in. A client, a customer will come to Sparkspace and say they need a system that can allow them to process this particular amount of data, or a system that they can feed information in and it produces relevant outcomes. So what we then do is we go into the organization, we look at their needs, look at their requirements, what they ultimately want to achieve, and then we design a system for them. And then we go back to the retailer, or the hardware vendor, and say we need XYZ systems that we can then take from them and use the servers to produce the required information system. So you should already be thinking about project management tools now, such as critical path analysis and Gantt charts, etc. And competition between resellers means that the margins are very small. So we need to ensure that we get a lot of customers, a lot of traffic, a lot of volume, or at least that the customers that we do get buy a substantial amount of our services, or we bill them for a substantial amount of our services, because we need to compete on volume almost. We cannot compete purely on value because there is so much competition. And so small margins and competition is very much a weakness of the organization, a weakness of the industry, and a potential threat going forward, a threat to the continued survival of the business. But Sparkspace does have considerable expertise in designing and building its own bespoke servers. So actually, we do, in a sense, make our own servers. Not everything comes from the hardware vendors, but it also throws up new labor requirements. So we cannot just employ people that specialize in consultancy services, maintenance services. We also need engineers who can build the servers. And these servers are built from various bought-in components, the same components that the hardware vendors use. However, we know that these bought-in components come from specialist manufacturers. So therefore, the supply power of these specialist manufacturers may be far higher than the generic hardware companies. However, is there an advantage to buying these things directly from them rather than from the hardware vendor? Of course, the hardware vendor has to make their own margin, so the price may be cheaper. But does the cost of installing and creating these servers reduce any cost saving? Because of course, a hardware vendor may be a specialist in creating the actual physical server. However, how difficult is it to adapt a server bought from a hardware vendor than it is to create our own one? Because the generic servers created by the hardware vendors perhaps do not have the processing power, do not have the amount of data processing capacity required for the kinds of things that our customers may wish to do. And so therefore, our servers, if they're going to be for a complex economic or engineering simulation as suggested here, requires far greater skill in its assembly. So assembling these servers will be critical to success of the business, and of course it will require staff of the highest level, engineers of the highest level of training to do so. And the page concludes with some information on the greater environment. So Sparkspace is based in Westland. So initially we should be thinking about the greater environment, so pestle analysis here. What is the political state of Westland? Is it a government that perhaps very much favours public-owned services and therefore may make it harder for private organisations? However, it's worth noting that government bodies are actually some of the largest customers of IT consultants, such as Sparkspace, in the real world. So therefore there may be a lot of work to be done with the government. So you need to be thinking about business to government advertising rather than business to consumer advertising here. Governments have a lot of private information that needs to be kept secure, and therefore perhaps may employ an IT consultant like Sparkspace to build a very, very secure system, a very, very secure server, encrypted server that allows them to keep all that information safe. You also have to think about the economy. Now, services like IT services can often be very expensive, and it requires larger businesses. Very small organizations, the local corner shop, are not going to need huge, expensive server systems. And therefore the economy or the makeup of the economy is very important to an industry or to a company such as Sparkspace, because it needs large corporate customers, it needs large wealthy customers, and therefore the economy is relevant here. The social change is probably in Sparkspace's favour. A lot more things are going online, a lot more things are going on smartphones, and therefore the need for decent server systems that allow companies to run their websites with a lot of traffic are very important. Technology obviously will be an incredibly important one here because the company relies on technology in a sense. It relies on customers needing new technological needs. It relies on manufacturers creating the latest technological advances. It needs processors to be getting faster and faster so it can build faster and faster servers, etc. Environmental needs. Now you may think that environment will not affect a server-based company too much, but you have to remember that a lot of these servers use a huge amount of power, which of course comes from electricity, which comes from the burning of fossil fuels. So it does have an impact on the environment. And finally, legal. So this could be laws relating to the IT industry. It could also be laws relating to everyone else, such as corporate customers. It could be something like a new law passed that meant they have to have a certain level of security for all their information, which of course would be a good thing for Sparkspace because it now has more markets or more potential customers to build high-tech security systems for. Now on to some information about Sparkspace from the Sparkspace website. The first thing that we can see is that Sparkspace is the authorized reseller for a range of major hardware vendors. So is that an exclusive authorization, exclusive reseller? Or are there many resellers that these major hardware vendors employ? But it does bring up questions about supplier relations, and supplier relations must be incredibly important to Sparkspace. Now supplier relations often involves a lot of toing and froing. So obviously, we want the best possible deal for Sparkspace and the vendor wants the best possible deal for them. But of course that is going to have the opposite effect on the other company. So we have to come to appropriate arrangements that offer each company a fair deal. For example, we may want a long line of credit because of course we may have to purchase these servers from the hardware vendor, and it will be a long time before we've finished doing stuff to the servers and installing the servers at the client's offices. So we will, in a sense of, got our servers from our supplier, but it'll still be a long time before we complete the job that we're doing with them and therefore get paid by our client. So we would perhaps want a lot of credit because we don't want to have to pay for the servers straight away because we are not getting the money in from what we're doing with them yet. And so that could lead to cash flow problems. It also says here that the parent company is a 100% owner of a number of subsidiaries. Now it doesn't actually say exactly whether or not it is Sparkspace who are the owner or whether they are owned, but regardless we have stakeholders here. So if we are an owned company, then we have a key player in our owners. That's of course on the stakeholder matrix, the Mendelow's matrix, which we should also include our suppliers on. So now let's take a look at the number of products, the number of ways in which Sparkspace assists its clients. So first of all, we have pre-sale. So this is before they've agreed to buy anything. It's just, in a sense, a discussion, a chat over what Sparkspace can do for a client. So the first thing is to work with the client's IT department to identify what is needed and recommend appropriate hardware. So this will be a discussion about your services, Sparkspace services, what they can give to the client and what the client needs. And this is perhaps best assessed by looking at the best categories. BEST is a mnemonic that stands for business, economical, social and technological. So BEST, business, stands for what the business needs. Does it fulfill the business needs? Do we have a service, or can we create a product, create a service that fulfills the client's needs? Just like with Walmart, they had a big data system that allowed them to establish correlations between purchases of products. Is that what the client wants to do? Do we have a system that allows them to achieve this? Can we help them achieve this? The next is economical. Is it possible for the budget that they have? Obviously, that's not worth doing if they're going to only make an extra $10,000 back from it, but it costs $100,000. It's not worth doing. The social aspect this time applies to the workforce within the organization, within the client's organization. Are they going to take kind to this? Will they need training in it? Will they be happy with it? If this new system is going to threaten their jobs because they don't need as many employees because they have this new system, is that likely to cause a lack of motivation? And finally, technological. Is it technically possible? Do we have a system? Can we create a system that can actually allow them to meet these needs? We also then have to go to our hardware vendors and negotiate prices on behalf of the clients. So in this case, we should be acting in behalf or on behalf of the clients, not for ourselves. So should we be trying to get the best deal for the client themselves? The next service provider is a consultancy service. So this is your more traditional value-adding services, taking the service given to us or we buy from the hardware vendors and then discussing how we can use these systems to support the client. This would be your more planning stage of your project management. The next one is installation. So this again ties back to project management. This would be the big project management service that they offer. You can see here that providing project management service for large-scale parties is all part of this. Now, budget is important here. The project budget, you'll be in charge of this, as your role is to look after projects and to work with companies and work with the consultants to create appropriate projects, appropriate pricing for projects. So negotiating good deals with the hardware vendors, because of course sticking to budget is incredibly important. If we go way over budget, then that is not a good service that we've provided. We've told the client it's going to cost around this much, but we actually end up spending twice as much money creating the project. And therefore they either may not wish to pay that much for it, or they will pay it but then they'll be unhappy and they won't use SparkSpace again. The next one is maintenance. So maintenance ties in with your consultancy service in a sense, and it's more to do with value adding, it's more to do with value chain analysis. So it comes under after sales service. It's a recurring theme here that value adding and value analysis is an important part of what the business does. It's all about generating additional value, taking products from hardware vendors, creating additional value by more appropriately configuring them, more appropriately installing them, and helping our clients meet their ultimate goal, their ultimate needs. Because of course a lot of clients rely very heavily on their servers. If their server goes down, their website may go down. It means people can't make purchases, people can't deal with them, which of course will have a huge impact on their business. And you can actually turn an unhappy customer into a happy customer with an effective way of managing problems as and when they arise. And finally, assembly. So assembling bespoke servers. So rather than just taking the ones that we get from the hardware vendors, we get the components, the bought-in components from the specialist manufacturers and create advanced, in-depth servers designed specifically to meet the client's needs. We also saw on the earlier page that a lot of competition between resellers and the hardware vendors themselves is very intense, very fierce, and therefore it's very difficult to differentiate yourself. And this perhaps is a way in which they can. Rather than by using the generic components, they're creating specialist servers that cannot be purchased on the open market. And another important factor here is that all of these services that are provided will require very technologically adept, experienced, well-trained staff, who of course will in turn require good compensation, decent compensation. They will need to be motivated, they will need to be adequately recognized for their work and adequately rewarded for their work. So experienced, well-trained staff is incredibly important in this industry. So already only 3 pages into this preseen we can see some recurring issues. So issues relating to value, issues relating to staff, issues relating to being able to differentiate the service that you provide. It's a very competitive environment, competitive industry. And so we should be taking these issues forward with us through the rest of our analysis. So I hope you've enjoyed this sample video and more importantly found it useful. Before I go, I'd like to quickly tell you about a few of the products that we do here at Astranti Financial Training, specifically for our case study courses. We have a study text which details all the key theories in which you will be expected to use in your case study exam, as well as details of how to approach the preseen and the case study. We also have a series of course videos detailing how to answer case study questions. This is actually an area in which many students struggle. Most of the scripts that I've seen, the failing scripts that I've seen, has actually been due to poor case study technique rather than lack of knowledge. We also have a series of preseen analysis videos based on the current up-to-date preseen, detailing all the key bits of information and likely issues you may face in the exam. Next up is the industry analysis, a pack detailing information about the industry that the preseen company resides in, information about the key players within that industry, and more background information on the industry in general. We also have a range of mock exams created for each level and based on the current preseen, which is a great way to get some practice in before you sit the real thing. We also offer marking and feedback on those mock exams so you can see where you are going wrong and where you can improve. Finally, we have the master classes. These are 2 one-day classes taken by our expert tutors to give you all the hints and tips you need to really add to your chances of passing the exam. Also, if you take our full course, we offer a pass guarantee, which, provided you have met all the requirements of the pass guarantee, you will get a free resit on the next exam should you fail to pass. So once again, thank you for your time. If you're interested in any of these products, please visit the website www.astranti.com for more information. Thank you.